There was a small cardboard box in American kitchens during World War II. The thing most families opened with quiet hesitation. It didn't contain eggs, not real ones. But for 4 long years it had to. Inside was a pale yellow powder that looked like dust, smelled faintly like chalk, and was supposed to become breakfast. This wasn't just a substitute. It was a test of trust, of patience, of whether you could feed your children something that didn't crack, didn't spoil, and didn't feel like food at all. And here's what most people never knew. The rules for using it were stricter than you'd think. The taste? Well, that depended on a secret most families never learned. And the reason it existed at all? That story begins long before the war, and it shaped the way America ate for decades after. Let's go back. It's 1943. You're standing in your kitchen on a Tuesday morning. The sun is just starting to come through the window above the sink, warming the countertop where you've set out your ration book. You need to make breakfast. Your husband will be leaving for the factory soon. Your children are still in their pajamas, waiting at the table. You reach into the cupboard. No eggs. You used your last 2 yesterday. Your ration stamps for fresh eggs won't refresh until next week. But there, on the second shelf, is a small box. It's light, almost too light. The label reads, "Dried whole egg powder, U.S. government inspected." You've heard about this. Your neighbor mentioned it last month, said it wasn't bad if you knew how to use it right. But you've also heard the jokes, the complaints, the rumors that it tasted like cardboard, or worse, nothing at all. Still, you open it. Inside is a fine, pale yellow powder that doesn't look like anything you've ever cooked with before. You pour a little into a bowl, add water, stir. And as you do, you wonder, is this really what eggs have become? But what most people never knew is why this powder had to exist at all, and what the government wasn't telling families about how it was made. The story of powdered eggs doesn't begin with the war. It begins with a problem that had haunted armies and travelers for centuries. How do you carry eggs without them breaking? How do you feed soldiers overseas when fresh food spoils in days? How do you ship protein across an ocean without refrigeration, without waste, without risk? For years, the answer was simple. You didn't. Eggs were too fragile, too perishable, too precious to send to the front lines. But in the early 1930s, a handful of American food scientists started experimenting with a new process. They called it spray drying. The idea was strange, almost unnatural. Take a fresh egg, crack it, blend the yolk and white together, then spray the liquid through a machine so hot, so fast, that all the moisture evaporates instantly, leaving only a dry, powdery dust. It sounded impossible, but it worked. By 1938, the U.S. Department of Agriculture had perfected a Guinean formula. And when the war began in 1941, the government knew exactly what to do with it. Here's what most families didn't understand. Powdered eggs weren't created for them. They were created for the soldiers. In 1942, the U.S. military needed to feed millions of troops stationed in Europe, the Pacific, North Africa, places where fresh eggs would rot in transit. So the government made a deal with American egg farmers. We'll buy your eggs, all of them, and we'll turn them into powder. Factories were built, machines were installed, and within months, Thousands of pounds of dried egg powder were being shipped overseas in crates marked for military use only. But there was a problem, a quiet one. The factories were producing too much, more powder than the military could use. And at the same time, back home, fresh eggs were disappearing from store shelves. Farmers were selling to the government. Chickens were being redirected to feed soldiers. Families were rationed to 1 or 2 dozen eggs per month, if they were lucky. So the government made a second decision, a controversial one. They would release the surplus powdered eggs to American civilians, not as a gift, as a replacement, and they would market it as patriotic. When powdered eggs first appeared in American grocery stores in late 1942, they were met with suspicion. The boxes were small, plain, labeled with government seals and instructions written in stiff official language. Reconstitute with water. Use immediately. Do not overcook. Housewives stood in the aisles, turning the boxes over in their hands, reading the labels. Twice. Some bought them out of curiosity. Others bought them because they had no choice. But almost everyone had the same question. What does it taste like? And here's the truth. Most people didn't know how to use it. The instructions were vague. The measurements were confusing. And the powder itself? It didn't behave like a real egg. It clumped if you added too much water. It turned gray if you cooked it too fast. It smelled faintly metallic if you left it sitting too long. But the worst part, it didn't taste like anything. Not eggs, not food, just powder. And yet families kept buying it, because the alternative was worse. No eggs at all. But what the government never told them was how long this would last, and that the strictest rules hadn't even begun. By 1943, powdered eggs had become a permanent fixture in American kitchens, not because people loved them, but because they had no choice. Fresh eggs were rationed, unpredictable, and when your ration stamps ran out, the only option left was that small cardboard box on the shelf. Let's walk through what it was like. It's early, still dark outside. You're standing at the stove, heating a skillet with a little bit of butter, carefully measured because butter is rationed too. You open the box of egg powder. The instructions say 2 tablespoons powder, 2 tablespoons water equals 1 egg. You measure it. Measure. Out. Spoon the powder into a bowl. Add the water. Stir. The mixture turns pale yellow, but it's thinner than you expected. Watery. You pour it into the skillet anyway. It sizzles, spreads unevenly, and as it cooks, the smell hits you. Not quite eggs, not quite anything else. Your children come to the table. They don't complain. Not anymore. They've learned. But you see it in their faces, the slight hesitation before the first bite, the way they chew slowly, swallowing without comment. You sit down with them, take a bite yourself. It's edible. That's the best you can say. It's edible, but it's not breakfast the way you remember it. And you wonder, how long will we have to keep doing this? What most people didn't realize is that powdered eggs came with rules, unspoken ones, rules you learned through trial and error, whispered advice from neighbors, and mistakes you couldn't afford to make twice. Rule number 1, never use too much water. If you added even a little extra, the eggs would turn to soup. Thin, gray, impossible to cook into anything solid. Rule number 2, Never cook them too hot. High heat made them rubbery, tough, the texture of old leather. Rule number 3, never let them sit. Once you mixed the powder with water, you had minutes, maybe 10, before the mixture started to separate, smell strange, turn sour. And here's the rule nobody told you. Rule number 4, never expect them to taste like eggs. Because they didn't. They tasted like survival. But there was something housewives discovered. A trick. A secret passed quietly from kitchen to kitchen. If you wanted powdered eggs to taste like something, anything, you had to add fat. Butter if you had it, bacon grease if you'd saved it, a little milk if your ration allowed. The powder itself had no flavor, but fat gave it richness. Salt gave it taste. And if you scrambled it fast, folded in a little cheese or chopped onion, you could almost convince yourself and your children that it was real. Almost. But the ingredient that mattered most? Patience. Because the first time you made powdered eggs, they were terrible. The second time, slightly better. By the 10th time, you'd learned. And by the 100th time, you'd stopped noticing. Powdered eggs weren't just for scrambling. That's what the government wanted you to believe. But resourceful American housewives figured out dozens of ways to use them. You could bake with them. Cakes, muffins, biscuits. Any recipe that called for eggs could technically use the powder instead. The texture was different, denser, drier, but it worked. You could make omelets, though they never quite held together the way fresh eggs did. You could fold them into casseroles, mix them into meatloaf, stir them into pancake batter. And here's what's remarkable. Some women got so good at using powdered eggs that their families stopped asking for fresh ones. Not because the powder tasted better, but because they'd learned how to make it work. Still, there was always a moment, a Sunday, morning maybe, or a birthday, when someone at the table would pause, fork halfway to their mouth, and say softly, "I miss real eggs." And everyone would nod. Because they did, they all did. But there was something else happening with these little boxes, something most families never saw. A divide, a quiet inequality. And it started the moment some people realized powdered eggs could be traded. Here's what the government didn't talk about. Powdered eggs became currency. Not officially, not legally, but in the quiet back rooms of grocery stores, in hushed conversations between neighbors, in the growing black market that lived just beneath the surface of wartime America. Powdered eggs had value, because if you had fresh eggs, you didn't need the powder. And if you had the powder, you could trade it for something else, something better. Not every family struggled equally. Some families lived on farms. They had chickens, fresh eggs every morning, more than they could use. For them, the little cardboard boxes of powder sat untouched in the cupboard. Government rations they'd accepted but didn't need. Other families lived in cities, apartments with no space for livestock, no access to farmers, no connections. For them, powdered eggs weren't a backup plan. They were the only plan. And the difference between those two worlds was everything. By 1944, there were rumors, whispers, people trading ration stamps for fresh eggs under the table, farmers selling directly to restaurants, bypassing the government system entirely. Families hoarding boxes of powdered eggs, then reselling them at inflated prices to desperate neighbors. It wasn't widespread, but it happened, and the government knew. There were posters, warnings, reminders that hoarding was unpatriotic, that black market trading hurt the war effort, that every family needed to share the burden equally. But enforcement was inconsistent, and for some, the temptation was too strong. If you had access, you used it. If you didn't, you made do with the powder. And here's what nobody said out loud. There was shame in it. Shame in opening that box. Shame in serving your children something that didn't taste like food. Shame in knowing that somewhere, someone else's children were eating real eggs for breakfast while yours made do with dust and water. It wasn't anyone's fault. Not really. But it felt that way. And that feeling, that quiet resentment, lingered in kitchens across America. Most people never spoke about it, but they felt it. Every time they opened the cupboard, every time they measured out 2 tablespoons of powder, every time they stirred. But there was a moment when everything changed, a moment when even powdered eggs became scarce, and families realized they'd taken even this strange substitute for granted. It happened in the winter of 1945. Quietly, without warning, the boxes of powdered eggs started disappearing. Not from every store, but from enough that people noticed. You'd go to the market on a Saturday morning, ration book in hand, ready to pick up your monthly allotment, and the shelf would be empty. "Shipment delayed," the clerk would say. "Try back next week." But next week, the shelf was still empty, and the week after that. And families who had grown used to the powder, who had learned to cook with it, to tolerate it, to stretch it into a dozen different meals, suddenly had nothing. People started asking questions. Where did the powder go? Why isn't there more? And slowly, the truth came out. The military needed it, all of it. The war in Europe was reaching its final phase. Troops were pushing deeper into Germany. Supply lines were stretched thin, and powdered eggs, lightweight, non-perishable, easy to transport, were being redirected entirely to the front lines. The surplus that had been released to American civilians? Gone. Pulled back. Sent overseas. And families at home were told, politely but firmly, "Make do. Let me show you what this looked like." It's February 1945. A mother stands in her kitchen staring into a nearly empty cupboard. No powdered eggs, no fresh eggs. Her ration stamps won't refresh for another 10 days. Her children are at the table, waiting. She has flour, a little sugar, some canned milk, but no eggs. She thinks about the pancakes she'd planned to make, the birthday cake she'd promised her daughter next week, the scrambled eggs her husband used to eat every morning before he left for the shipyard. All of it impossible now. She closes the cupboard, takes a breath, and starts rewriting the menu in her head. That's what it felt like. Not dramatic, not catastrophic. Just one more thing you couldn't have. One more thing you had to give up. And the hardest part, you didn't know when it would come back. Weeks passed, then months. Spring came. The war in Europe ended in May. And slowly, powdered eggs started reappearing on shelves, but by then, something had shifted. Families who had lived without them for months had learned to cook differently, to substitute in other ways, to expect less. And when the boxes finally came back, some people bought them, others didn't, because they'd realized something. They didn't need them anymore. not the way they used to. But there was one thing they couldn't forget: the feeling of opening that cupboard and finding it empty. The quiet fear that even this, a box of powder, could be taken away. And that feeling stayed. By the summer of 1945, the war was over. Fresh eggs started returning to grocery stores. Slowly at first, a few dozen here and there, then more. By autumn, rationing was easing, and by Christmas, most families could buy eggs again without ration stamps. Real eggs, fresh eggs, eggs that cracked. The powdered eggs, they didn't disappear immediately. The government still had stockpiles, factories still had inventory, and some families, especially those who had grown used to the convenience, the long shelf life, the reliability, kept buying them. But for most people, the moment fresh eggs came back, the powder was forgotten. Boxes were shoved to the back of cupboards, left unopened, eventually thrown away. It was over. Let me paint you one last picture. It's a Sunday morning in December 1945. A mother stands at the stove. In her hand is a fresh egg. She cracks it against the edge of the skillet. The shell splits cleanly. The yolk slides out, bright yellow, whole, perfect. It sizzles as it hits the pan. The smell fills the kitchen, rich, real, unmistakable. Her children look up from the table, and for the first time in 4 years, breakfast feels like breakfast again. That's how it ended, not with a celebration, not with fanfare, just a quiet return to normal. But normal felt like a gift. Here's what happened after the war. Powdered eggs didn't vanish completely. The military kept using them. Restaurants kept ordering them. And some families, especially those in rural areas or those who'd learned to cook with them well, kept a box or two on hand, just in case. But culturally, they became a punchline, a symbol of wartime hardship, something people joked about at dinner parties, laughed about in movies, shook their heads at when someone mentioned the war years. "Remember powdered eggs?" someone would say, and everyone would groan. But here's the thing, for the generation that lived through it, powdered eggs weren't funny. They were a survival. And if you grew up in a household where powdered eggs were a regular part of life during the war, you carried that with you, even decades later. Some people never wasted eggs again. They used every shell, every yolk, every drop. Some people kept a box of dried egg powder in the pantry, just in case, long into the 1950s, 60s, even 70s. Not because they needed it, but because they remembered what it felt like not to have it. And some people, especially women who had spent years learning to cook with powder, to stretch it, to make it work, never quite trusted fresh eggs the same way again. They'd crack an egg into a bowl and pause just for a second, remembering when eggs came from a box, when they weren't fragile, when they lasted forever. But powdered eggs did something else, something quieter. They changed the way America thought about food. Before the war, food was fresh or it wasn't food. Eggs came from chickens, milk came from cows, bread came from bakeries. But the war introduced a new idea. Food could be engineered, preserved, transformed. Eggs could be powder, milk could be condensed, meat could be canned. And after the war, that idea didn't go away. It grew. It became the foundation of the modern food industry. Instant mashed potatoes, powdered milk, freeze-dried coffee, boxed cake mixes. All of it traced back to the same wartime experiments that created powdered eggs. The same question, how do you make food last, and for better or worse? We've been answering that question ever since. If you talk to someone today who lived through World War II, someone in their 80s or 90s, and you mention powdered eggs, you'll see it in their face. A flicker of recognition, sometimes a smile, sometimes a grimace. "Oh, those," they'll say. And then they'll tell you a story about the first time their mother made them, about the way they smelled, about the trick their grandmother taught them. Add a little milk, a little butter, cook them slow. About the morning the fresh eggs came back. And if you listen closely, you'll hear something else. Gratitude, not for the powder itself, but for what it represented. The fact that even when everything else was uncertain, even when the world was at war, there was still breakfast. There was still something to eat. It wasn't perfect, but it was enough. So here's what I want you to think about, not as a history lesson, but as a memory, as a feeling. There was a time, not so long ago, when something as simple as an egg wasn't simple at all. When opening a box of powder and stirring it with water was an act of trust. Trust that the government knew what it was doing. Trust that the war would end. Trust that someday things would go back to normal. And they did. But the people who lived through it, they never forgot. They never forgot the taste of powdered eggs, the texture, the smell, the way it sat on the plate, looking like eggs, but not quite being eggs. And they never forgot what it taught them. That survival isn't always about having everything you need. Sometimes it's about making do with what you have. It's about learning, adapting, finding a way to feed your family even when the cupboard is almost empty. It's about measuring 2 tablespoons of powder, adding 2 tablespoons of water, and calling it breakfast. Not because you wanted to, but because you had to. And maybe, just maybe, that's the real lesson of the tiny box that replaced real eggs in World War II. Not that we can survive on less, but that we did, and we did it together, one breakfast at a time.